Hello students, welcome to week 7 for COM 550. This week we're looking at topics related to orality and literacy, and we're kind of extending our conversation of intercultural communications to look at some of the ways that language was shaped and society was shaped from a communicative historical perspective. Our week 7 agenda tells us that we're reading in chapter 29. That particular chapter looks at and considers the ideas of whose language really is it anyways, and when we consider something to be a native language, what does that have to mean, what does that mean, and what does that tell us about particular society or intercultural interactions. We're watching some videos on Walter Ong. He's our scholar of the week, so to speak, where we are considering all things related to him and his main ideas related to orality and literacy. So we have 2 videos, actually 3 videos on him, and then 1 video on shaping identity and culture. We're also completing our weekly review number 7. The original posts are due by Friday, with our reply post due no later than Sunday. And finally, we've reached the point in the semester where our intercultural journal is due. So we've been working on that since week 1. We've posted an update in week 3 or 4, and now we're at the point where we're actually submitting the entire journal. So we'll get into that as well. As you look at what's required for the entire journal, this should seem very familiar to you. You should have been logging some of your thoughts about information related to the course throughout the last 7 weeks. This was a time for you to kind of reflect and really think about your own cultural identity, Christianity, Christian worldview, perspective. How does that relate to intercultural experiences within this course, as well as other things you may have learned. So at this point, you should have 7 entries to be eligible for full credit, because it was a 7-week journal. And each entry should be about a half a page to a page in length. Now you're at the point where you will be constructing this into one APA paper with the dates and any notes and things you have for your actual intercultural interactions and journaling that you've had. I'm looking for, like I said, 7 entries that are at least a half a page to a page in length, addressing the course content for each week along the way. If you have any questions or anything with this, let me know. This entire thing is due this week, and I'm more than willing to reach out and work with you if you need help on that. Weekly review number 7. So this week in weekly review number 7, we're looking at particularly what is orality, how does it relate to the development of language, as well as intercultural communication, and how are orality and Christianity related to intercultural communication as well. You'll need to utilize 3 outside sources, which you'll have plenty of information to do that with this week based off of the course content, the videos, and the reading. To complete this, at least 500-word post due on Friday, with your reply post to at least 2 students no later than Sunday. When we look at orality and literacy, this is the seminal work of Walter Ong. He's noted as a communication historian and technological determinist, which we'll get into in a second. His book is a classic text in communication studies, particularly at the undergrad and at graduate level. I read it at all 3 stages of my academic career as being a student. Particularly, Walter Ong really considers that communication history is an extension of 3 stages of orality and history throughout culture and society. Communication really is an integral part in the development and establishment of society and culture. And when we consider Ong, it's important to consider that communication is a ritual. Walter Ong considers communication and looks at communication from a ritualistic perspective. So he doesn't look at the transmission of communication, rather he looks at the ritual of communication. That's where we focus on an inner experience with others, and that the part that communication is not just to impart messages from one place to another place, but really to build experiences and phenomenons and rituals that we utilize when we commune with one another. Walter Ong really gets into this idea of commune and the root word of communication as a core part of communicating. So community, things of that nature. Really the idea, though, that communication is a ritual in this sense is to educate and advance society and establish cultural and societal norms and ways of living. Ong supported technological determinism. He was a technological determinist by nature. And that's really a person or a scholar that believes that media technologies shape how we as individuals and society think, feel, act, and how society may operate. So it's really important to consider that. We believe, technological determinist believes that a technological device such as this can drive society and drives how society interacts and functions, rather than the act of communication and social norms and things like that. Um, for the sake really of time, it's really important to know that Ong considered these 3 stages we're going to go through in its relation to oral cultures and literate cultures and how communication helps society evolve over time. When we look at Ong's stages of orality and literacy, there are 3 of them. Really, he considers the first and primary stage in all communication and social history as orality, this idea of oral cultures. We know this to be true. We know that there was a point in time where the only type of communication that was utilized was kept and maintained and used in a pure oral fashion, verbal communication, and these types of communication transactions. We know that there was typically in a cultural setting or a tribal setting that there was someone that was an orator or somebody that was known as with a lot of wisdom that kept all of the information, was in charge of all of the information of that society to pass it down to each generation. So they would sit around fires or they would sit around in a circle and talk about and teach their people group about important information in oral settings, usually through stories, usually through myth, ways and things that were easy in mnemonic devices and ways of passing things down so it was easy to recall and memorize. Now remember, at this point, before we had written communication, culturally and societally, groups could only store a certain amount of information, that in which we could remember. So with that, there was only a certain amount of information available to people. With literacy, there became the sophistication and formal schooling and formal ways of learning and storing and recalling knowledge with the ability to read and write. And so there was a fundamental shift between the orality stage and the literacy stage in the way that we created, maintained, and stored communication within society. Between this, though, when literacy and orality came to be, so with the advent of the printing press, things of that nature, there was a cultural divide and fundamental shift between literate and non-literate cultures. And what ended up being is that literate cultures tended to be people from, or typically were people from more affluent backgrounds, higher social order, social class, social ranking within society because they had access to tutors and things of that nature to teach them how to read and become literate. Whereas those with less money that came from poorer economic backgrounds and things of that nature typically were non-literate. So this cultural divide ensued because non-literate cultures and non-literate people groups within social structures were dependent on the people that were literate. And so what really happened from this and what was known is that Virginia Woolf really explains that there was an intellectual evolution and the transitions of cultures between oral and literate cultures. Really in this intellectual evolution, it determined and looked at how we attain knowledge within our brain. And really what happened was as the human brain evolved to the point where more neural pathways were created and actually became more advanced as a species through literacy. So we were able to retain and store information more effectively, and our brain adapted to this accommodation. What happens is that those with lower places in society typically became oppressed and did not advance or be able to move through this upward mobility movement into different areas within the social structure because they could not access literacy or be taught how to read. And we've seen this throughout history. And so we're at this point now where we're in a transition from literacy to second orality, but the literate culture, this idea of literacy within a communication history ensued for centuries, from the advent of the printing press all the way up until this idea of this digital divide, which is more common today. So second orality tells us that, and the primary argument behind it is that scholars are contending, and Ong even contends that we are moving back towards an oral culture. Not an oral culture in the way that we are as unsophisticated in being able to recall and maintain information as it was originally, but that our primary form of communication is reliant on and based off of images. And we are using digital communication as a primary form, which is moving away from this idea of literacy and a literate culture, which relies primarily on writing, like handwriting, and reading text. So digital communication does not really require the use of text in the ways that it was known in a pure literate culture, like we've known for centuries. Rather, we consume information digitally and rely heavily on broadcast videos, pictures, and and socialization, things like social networks, as a primary form of communication. So we become an image-based society based off of what we view and what we're able to get and maintain in quick access on devices like these. And so what's happening is that we're transitioning from a literacy to a second orality, where we're seeing a sophistication of how we're able to recall, store, and keep information. It's also this idea that we no longer have to have written communication, books, notes, things of that nature to gain knowledge, that we can use images, things we're finding through Google searches or through social networking or things of that nature, to recall and gain access to knowledge. And what's happening is that this cultural divide is no longer as great, because we all have access to literacy now through FAPE and formal schooling and free education to all. But what happened is now there's this digital divide. Those that can gain access to digital devices and maintain and keep those within society, and those that cannot. And so where does this all relate to what we're talking about this week? Well, we're looking at language this week. Chapter 29 talks about whose language is it anyways, and gives us a phenomenal article on looking at the maintenance of language and what native language really is from a scholarly perspective. And so if we consider what Ong tells us about orality and literacy in some of the videos that we watch, it's important to understand how this relates to intercultural interactions. How orality and literacy and second orality was shaped in different cultures can definitely impact how those cultures communicate today. What they know about those things and what we innately know about being literate and non-literate and things like that can significantly impact how we use language. So as we're moving towards writing our critical assignments next week, it's important to keep that in mind. That critical assignment is really important and pivotal in looking at international and intercultural relations of those outside of the U.S. So do keep that in mind. And this can definitely play a role in that. As you look through and recap the week 7 agenda, it's important to know, like I said, we're reading chapter 29. We're watching 3 videos on Ong, phenomenal calm scholar, and we're reading and developing weekly review number 7 with its post due on Friday and its replies due on Sunday, as well as intercultural journal is due. If you have any questions, let me know, and I look forward to interacting with you. God bless.